Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter Swoboda, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Okay, everybody. Welcome back to Inspired Change. Firstly, I want to start this podcast off by giving a big shout out to Brownie and Luke. We did 2 podcasts in a row in a studio. It was a lot of fun. I'd never done that before. Firstly, neither of us had been on anyone else's podcasts before, so that was a new experience for all of us. And secondly, it was interesting the way that we actually warmed into the conversation with one another. Now, I'd met Brownie before. I mean, he was very open about coming to see me as a client, and it took me quite a bit of time to sort of warm to the idea of, doing something more publicly together. But as I said on the podcast at the time, to me that it became a no-brainer in the sense that we want to demystify the whole issue of seeing a psychologist, especially for us as men. I keep going over this, but as men we tend to be a little bit shy about reaching out for help, whether that's for our physical health or for our mental health or both. And in fact, I would probably say that we're a little bit shy. So again, let me reach out. Brownie, Luke, thanks for being on the show. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed doing the whole program with you. So if you guys haven't heard it, my audience hasn't heard it, please go to skip this podcast, and it's Luke and Brownie having a conversation, basically, which is what I like to encourage. And so we're really in sync with that whole number. Now, you might notice when you listen to them that there's a little bit of irreverence and a little bit of jocularity going on, and I think that's probably an important aspect when we're talking about some really serious issues, especially things like mental health, suicide, parenting, being a partner, and all that sort of meaningful stuff. And, some people may be a little bit offended. Some people may think that this is a bit flippant. But, take it easy. It's all coming from the right place, from the heart. And that's one of the things that we want to encourage each other to do, is have conversations from the heart. They're usually the meaningful ones. We're good at doing all the other stuff about sport and politics and business and property and all that sort of thing. But the real ones is a little bit more difficult, and it takes a little bit of time to warm into. And I thought that given the situation, which was quite artificial, sitting in a studio, which was very nice, and big shout out to Paul Najjar from Jammin' in a Jar Studios, who did and does a tremendous job in organising, the quality of the product. So, the podcasts just sound fantastic. So thanks, Paul. Until next time. And there will be a next time. So what did I get from doing both of the podcasts? Well, the first thing is that I think we're on the same page, and that is that the conversation really is coming from an individual place of where each of us has reflected about what mental health is about for us. And so it was interesting because Brownie's experience was very much coming from a deep, dark place of pain. And Luke, too, had to really pull the stops out in coping with something very, very personal as a new parent, and that is the illness of his child. And that's pretty confronting stuff all round. And I haven't been devoid either of traumatic or difficult experiences in my life. The death of my father was a serious surprise. It came out of the blue. And, then having to work with my mother through her, fairly extended illness, cardiovascular disease, congestive heart failure, and finally facing the end with her. But there's also been other experiences. Now, one of the things that I thought I'd do in today's session is actually talk about, the phrase that we keep coming up with, which is we're talking about mental health. And doing the podcast both inspire change, but also then skip this podcast with Luke and Brownie, I realised that this is a really broad topic, but we keep using the label, and I'm not sure necessarily whether everybody out there is really clear about what it is that we're talking about, because frequently the conversation defaults into issues of, trauma, of anxiety, of depression. There could be lots of other sort of mental health diagnoses that are going on. And in a sense, when we talk about mental health diagnosis, it's actually an oxymoron. It's a paradox. Because if I'm, looking at mental health, that means something different to having a diagnosable psychological disorder or even a psychiatric illness. So one of the things that I wanted to do today, amongst other things, is just clarify that landscape a little bit, both from the point of view of being a psychologist, but also from the point of view of being a lay person. So for a moment, imagine, we're in a conversation and someone brings up this topic called mental health. So what is it that you think about immediately when you hear that phrase? Now, generally speaking, mental health is used as a substitute for mental health conditions, such as depression, anxiety, bipolar, personality disorders, and so on. Okay? But what we're really trying to do, actually, when we talk about mental health is broaden this out. Now, according to the World Health Organization, when we talk about mental health, we're talking about a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a clear contribution to his or her community. So, mental health, fundamentally, from the World Health Organization's point of view, is all about wellness rather than illness. And so the question that comes up with that is, well, now we're looking on a much, much broader framework that we need to navigate. So how do we get to have good mental health? What does that really mean on a day-to-day basis? And I think for a lot of people that gets a little bit confusing. Most of us have gotten pretty clear about diagnoses like depression, anxiety, OCD, ADHD, ADD. Those sort of things have gotten a bit more of traction in the community. So it's interesting that on the one hand we're talking about wanting, mental health issues to be less stigmatized. Well, good mental health is actually not stigmatized because most or a large number of people actually experience quite a strong level of well-being in that regard. Unfortunately, we've had this huge transition, or fortunately, we've had the transition from ignoring mental health distress and disorders to now bringing it out much, much more into the public, into the forum to discuss and talk about. So I want to talk a little bit about the positive side about mental health as a general label, if we want to call it that. because I think that's really important to understand. What is it that is going to give each and every one of us a sound state of mental health? And so, I can look at it chronologically. So what happens, through mum's gestation to when the child is born, what happens in the first, few months, the first year, the first 3 years, then on to the age of 7, and so on. So what happens? What is it that a human being really needs to develop this thing called mental health, well-being? And from here on in, let me address this as mental well-being. Now, as you may gather if you've listened to previous podcasts that I've done, is that to me, physical and mental well-being is in fact intertwined. You really can't necessarily have one with the other in a way. I mean, you can have a physical illness and still be psychologically resilient. But that's, again, even then in a different sort of ballpark. I want to keep it a little bit more simple. So, mental well-being rests on being able to practice behaviours on a day-to-day basis that are useful to myself, both physically as well as mentally. Things like, good sleep, doing some exercise, doing some relaxation, making sure I don't overdo things in the nutrition department or in terms of my overuse of drugs and alcohol or any use of that in some instances. Okay, so anything that's going to interfere with my sense of equilibrium, my sense of flexibility and awareness. And so I'll come back to what I've talked about before in a lot of podcasts, which is I need to be always looking to grow my self-awareness. That is to have a certain level of ongoing introspection, to be able to better understand myself, to be able to, by definition, understand other people and be able to relate with them on that basis. So that foundation of self-awareness and the capacity to reflect is going to be a very important cornerstone in this framework. The other thing that I need to be conscious of in that is to allow myself to be able to move flexibly between my thinking, my feelings, my decision making in relationship to myself, but also in my relationship towards others. So it's a bit like, and the phrase that I used in the podcast with the guys was that a bit like being a psychological ninja. That is, I'm quick on my feet, I'm stealthy, but I'm present. I have this capacity to be flexible enough to adapt to my changing inner and outer landscape. So, what is that going to do for me? Well, apart from giving me resilience, which has become a real buzzword, in other words, what it's going to do is make me be able to both enjoy life and myself and the people in it, but also to derive a sense of purpose and meaning, and through that some satisfaction. Now you're noticing that I'm not really focusing here on being happy, because my pursuit, and I've said this time and time again, my pursuit of happiness can actually lead to me feeling less than happy. In fact, it can lead to despair and ultimately to some destruction. So mental well-being is a framework through which I persistently and consistently move to enhance who I am, what I'm about, and what I do. And again, with the guys, we were talking about not over-focusing on doing all the time. As men, we're sort of programmed into identifying the problem and then trying to fix it. Now, certainly most of us will concede that in a relationship with a partner, that can be irritating, especially if I'm not really listening to my partner. So, in a lot of the conversations that we're currently having in the men's space, our main focus, our main concern has been with the issue of unwellness or dis-ease as opposed to mental well-being. And I want to focus on the well-being bit. And that's where I talk about making good men great. Now, ironically, both Luke and Brownie in this space, like a lot of guys that are coming forward, are actually a good example of leadership in the men's space. They have decided very courageously to step out into the public space to talk openly about their ups and downs, emotionally, physically, socially, without censoring it. And it's one of the things that I really appreciated about the whole experience of working with these two guys, both in my podcast but also in theirs. So part of, getting to be mentally well, the first step is helping kids to be mentally well, but also physically well. And so as an adult who has children and grandchildren, that's a focus for me. I want to be the best possible person in the best possible context that I can be, but to also demonstrate how I, as an adult, can deal with the curveballs that life's likely to throw at me. And life is not predictable. Anyone who believes that, please check in again, because you're going to be in for a rude shock. I'm a bit on the page of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and that is that, any sense of predictability is potentially misleading, because the universe tends to be chaotic. And yes, we may see patterns, but that could be a wholly subjective process and have absolutely nothing to do with reality. A good example of that are conspiracy theories. Okay, so again, let me come back. For the next little while, one of the things that I want to do is I want to focus on the issue of mental well-being as opposed to the issue of mental dis-ease. Okay, any questions about that, please don't hesitate to touch base with me. I'm sure at the end of the podcast, Miranda or someone else is going to put down some contact details. I'd really love to hear some feedback around that, because we need to balance the conversation. We actually really do need to draw out within, the professional circle, but also within the community as a whole, how the two link up. Where does mental well-being mutate into mental dis-ease? And that's a big question, and I think that needs clarifying, and I'm certainly, wanting to help do that in the community. Right now, a lot of men and myself are still working on getting men to engage in going and recognizing when they're mentally in a state of dis-ease and putting their hand up for some help. But ultimately, on a broader level, we want to work together to create mental well-being. And on that note, until next time, I'm going to sign off. As I said, if there's any questions, please don't hesitate to get some contact stuff off to me, and we can maybe have a chat. Also looking to get some feedback, so if there's any feedback, I'd appreciate that as well. And any suggestions for topics, I'm happy to certainly consider them. If not, put them on the program. All right, until next time, this is Gunter signing off. Take care.
Thank you, Gunter. And thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Again, if you have any questions or comments or ideas for a show, you can email development@noirtainment.com. That's development@noirtainment.com. Thank you, and thank you for listening.